Is Philip Hammond right to say you're being misled by politicians about the economy because they think you wouldn't vote for anyone if they told you what was actually really necessary? Professor Danny Blanchflower is Professor of Economics at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire, who is a former member of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. Thank you for coming on the programme again, Danny. Your view of what Philip Hammond is saying, do you think he is right? And if so, what's he actually right about?
Well, not really at all. The reality is that this chap was the Chancellor of the Exchequer between 2016 and 2019. And the opportunity then was for the government to borrow hugely at really cheap prices because interest rates were so low. So if he had done more or less exactly the opposite to what he did, which was invest in stuff like the NHS and infrastructure and other things, borrowing money at really, really low rates, we wouldn't be in this situation. And it's pretty disingenuous of a Tory Chancellor to talk about anybody else, given that they've been in office for 14 years, imposed austerity, and austerity killed off growth. What growth does is it improves the public purse. So I think this is just disingenuous nonsense. I mean, we're really in a position where the country essentially has to get itself out of recession. I mean, I was just looking at the data as you were speaking. The UK is in recession. So what the people at the Bank of England are saying, rate cuts are a long way off. The UK economy is in recession. So normally what you do is you have to get yourself out of it by spending and investing. And the truth is what matters is not what your public debt is what you spend it on. And so the Tory chancellors didn't borrow money when it was cheap, imposed austerity, went to Brexit, which destroyed growth. So they've got themselves in a horrible mess.
Well, now that money isn't cheap. But now that money
isn't now. Well, it isn't now.
Well, so they're not going to borrow now. And had they borrowed before, they would have been paying high levels of interest on that debt or paying that debt back down.
No, they could have borrowed in 2016 at low rates for a long time. So that's not true. They should have done that. So now they're in a position where they basically have to invest in the future and try and get the economy out of this situation that it's in. Remember in 2008, the story then was, you've got to worry about inflation. You can't get yourself out of this. And you basically say the economy is completely screwed. The UK is a rich country. Compare it to where I live. The economy and the bounce back in the US economy has actually been substantial. And the US economy didn't engage in austerity as the UK did. So you can always talk yourself around in a circle and say, oh, we can't really do anything. We've got to cut back on spending, and that will lower growth. But lowering growth means you have to cut back further. Austerity never works. It never has any economic basis. So I think he was talking utter and complete gobbledygook, as are members of NPC member Green today, who says, rate cuts are a long way off. The UK economy is in recession.
Their argument is if you cut rates now, when inflation is still hard to get down or needs to fall further, you'll only increase the chances of inflation going back up.
That's what they said in 2008. That's exactly what they said in August 2008. The economy had been in recession for quite a long time. They ended up worrying about raising rates, but inflation was set to plummet. And what really mattered was what happens to output. But I keep repeating, the UK economy is in recession. That's much more important than temporary inflation, which appears to be coming down. And today, in fact, you talked about yesterday, consumer prices in the United States, yes, did surprise on the upside. Well, in the last couple of hours, we've just had producer price inflation, which actually is a really good precursor of what consumer price, and that surprised on the downside. That's much less than people have thought. So the arguments from yesterday suddenly get turned around because now it looks like producer price inflation is surprising on the downside. So what you'll normally see will be the focus on inflation is a mistake, focusing on the real economy and output and what your listeners are feeling, right? The economy is in recession. You don't cut spending in a recession, you increase it.
Even if that means borrowing at incredibly high rates, loading that debt onto the generations of the future to pay off.
Come on, that's a really silly argument.
Why?
The argument of destroying generations by raising unemployment. I mean, what we're seeing right now is a generational effect, which I've written a lot about, which is collapsing well-being of the young. So what you do is you raise rates, you make it harder for the young people to get into the labour market. We have an absolute international disaster going on for the young. So yes, you say, inflation's a problem, but your problem is that the alternative you've created is much worse than the temporary problem of inflation, which is going to go away. So I don't buy any of it. I'm sorry. I mean, and in fact, in 2008, if you look back, all exactly those arguments were wrong. And in 2010, when the arguments made saying we have to impose austerity because that will generate growth, they were wrong as well. So we have to look back at history and listen to that. And the answer is that the US has done much, much better than the UK. It didn't impose austerity. It didn't cut back on spending, and cutting back on public spending crowds out the private sector. So I just think that there's 14 and a half years of history of this nonsense, and look at the mess it's got us into.